Hey, what's up, my people? John Middlekauff, new YouTube channel. What I need you to do, subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, share with your friends. Appreciate everyone that has. It's the podcast, 3 and Out. You can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Apple, Spotify. We got you covered. Also, thevolume.com. We got merch right here. Flex Fit hat. Go to thevolume.com. Get yourself a 3 and Out hat. Well, the off season is officially here, and it's time for the dynamic GMs and the dynamic front offices to separate themselves, because we got the combine, we got free agency, and then we have the draft, which we will be all over. So buckle up. Have some thoughts as we head in, some of the biggest stories, some of the things I'm looking for, and just some overall thoughts about this time of year. And Steve Sarkisian signed an enormous contract extension a little over a month ago, but it became public, and had a couple thoughts on just getting second chances, which I'm all for, and the ultimate legacy of Nick Saban. But before we dive into football, I had a buddy on Saturday. He's like, I'm at Riviera, where the PGA tournament was going down in Los Angeles. I'm like, how is it? He's like, it's extra awesome because I saved $20 using your promo code. I said, genius. That's because the official ticketing app of this podcast, Gametime, which if I had my smartphone near me, it's in the other room, I would show you. All you do is go to the App Store. You download an app called Gametime, and you search any event you want to go to. College, pro. You want to go to an NBA game. You want to go to the NCAA tournament, spring training, you name it. Concerts, any act you want to see. Just type their name in, or a venue near where you live or want to go, and see who's playing. And it shows you the seats by the price points, and it also gives you the view. And you use the promo code JOHN, JOHN, for your first order, and you save $20. Cannot recommend them enough. I've been using them for well over a year now. I've seen everything from sporting events to concerts, because I just type it in, my Gametime app, promo code JOHN, first pair of tickets, save $20. The NFL offseason's here. Not going to lie, I already kind of miss football. There's nothing like the period of time where you're, breaking down the events of a Sunday, right? The coaching decisions, the players who are excelling, the guys who didn't have good weeks, where franchises are headed, franchises that are going the right way, the wrong way, the playoff implications as we got into October, November, December, obviously the playoffs, the magnitude of every snap through the Super Bowl. I really enjoyed the season, but that's over now. There will not be pads put on shoulders, or not even that a lot of guys wear them anymore on their legs, but there's no more padded football till early August. And let's face it, now that preseason, because the majority of us are not going to go to training camp practices and watch team scrimmage, most of these preseason games, while it's exciting because we've missed football, suck now because no one except like 3 coaches plays their guys. So we don't really have real football till early September. But I love this time of year, because this time of year to me is the business of football. In the fall, it's actual football, right? It's the X's and O's. It's the Jimmies and the Joes. It's everything that we just listed. The coaching, the schematics, the strategy, the impact of kind of circumventing injuries, guys excelling that are young. That's all over now. And now is about why you pay your GM and your GM's cohesion with your salary cap guy. Because most GMs are not Howie Roseman and can't write a contract, right? Most guys depend on their money manager, right? Like all of us. I can't do my taxes. Have no fucking chance. Can't do it. That's why I pay a guy to do them. It's no different in the NFL. Most general managers are very, very dependent on their capologist, which in 2024 has never been more important, because the salary cap, which is about to be closer to $250 million than it is $200, is easy to manipulate. It's why when you see numbers of this team's over the cap or this team's, right around, all that's irrelevant. Tell me what their actual number is when free agency kicks off. You can cut guys, you can restructure. It's a very, very fluid thing. And to me, this time of year, and let's face it, most of my life GMs, like all the trades happen in basketball and baseball. There weren't that many trades in the NFL, especially when it came to big name guys. Well, you can throw that out the window with the amount of GMs, hovering 50 years and below in age, and their aggressive nature and their willingness to take chances. Now, part of everything that changed in the NFL was the influx of the amount of cash that's flowing in. For a long period of time, if I signed a player to a $20 million contract and I was still on the hook for paying him, I would not cut him. Why? These teams were not flush with cash. The amount of money these teams have now, 20, 30, $40 million that's already been paid. If you don't like the guy, get rid of him. It's why Russell Wilson is not going to be on the Denver Broncos. That ownership has so much money, they don't even care. Their coach wants to move, they're going to move. I don't care what Sean Payton said at the Super Bowl. Russell Wilson's not going to be on their team anymore. But to me, that's made for a much more eventful offseason. Now, the one thing that sucks in football, unlike those other two sports, in basketball, if Steph Curry or Kevin Durant or LeBron James is a free agent, he's truly a free agent. Aaron Judge a couple years ago, Shohei Ohtani, when they're free agents, they can truly play the market. That's not the way the National Football League works. I saw Schefter put out the list. There are a lot of really good players who are free agents. They can be franchise tagged, which I've always said, while it sucks for the individual, you're still compensated at a high level, one, and two, it benefits us, the fans, who bring all this money. Without us, this league doesn't exist. It would just be a lot of guys tackling people for free. So, and one thing the NFL has that these other sports do not have is cohesion. If you want to keep a player, you get to keep him for a long period of time. It's why, like I've said it forever in these other sports, the same players were on the same teams for a long period of time, and they really benefited. Now, only the NFL truly has that, right? If I don't want to lose a guy, I'm not going to lose him. Even if the contract becomes, hard to negotiate, which I don't blame any player and any agent for trying to get more money. Welcome to the real world. You don't deserve anything. You're worth what you negotiate. So when you look at this upcoming free agency, it's all about dynamic GMs. It's all about dynamic front offices. And one thing that's been very clear over the last half decade is aggressive wins. And Belichick has shown this for a long period of time. You can't worry about what the fans might see. Because I would say the majority of headlines have been like, oh, you can't trade Tyreek Hill. You can't? They won 2 Super Bowls since. You can't trade DeForest Buckner. Niners have been to 3 conference championships and a Super Bowl since. Right? So you make part of the NFL is deciding the hardest part about this time of year and the most important part is evaluating your own team. Right? Obviously, there are certain players that it's pretty clear what they are and how much they're worth. The majority of guys are not. And the majority of guys are, is this guy going to maintain this level of play? Is he going to start to slip the other way? Do we have a younger guy on our roster who can take his spot? Do we have a guy who is good enough to win at the highest level? Is this guy that we drafted in the second round last year going to take a step? Or did maybe we miss? Or do we need to bring in a guy to mitigate the risk of if he's actually not any good? Some guys pop early on in their careers, right away. Some guys take a little while. No one knew Devontae Adams, beside us Fresno State guys, was going to be a stud the first year and a half. It was pretty ugly. Some guys show up, Jamar Chase, and it's obvious from day one. Well, I guess not day one. He dropped some balls in August, but you know what I mean. And the front office, the cohesion between a general manager and their coaching staff is the strength of your team. And having everybody on the right page this time, or on the same page this time of year, is a must. And look at the NFL. Look how many teams, 7, 8 teams, have brand new coaches, have a brand new guy as their head coach, which essentially means you have all new assistant coaches. Maybe there's a holdover or two, but the majority of the guys on that staff are new. And then there's a ton of returning coaches that have either a new offensive or new defensive coordinator. Well, that can mean scheme changes. That can mean guys that were excelling on your team before are not going to be a fit. Going to be guys on your team before that didn't play much, actually might fit now. And beside the Niners and the Chiefs, a lot of teams have had several weeks, some even a month and a half, to kind of figure this out. Because I'll promise you this, by the time that you go to Indianapolis, you better have your own team evaluated. That means your GM and your coordinators and obviously your head coach, everyone's on the same page with what you have on your roster. Now, just because a guy is on your roster last year what's his contract status? Is he a free agent? Do we need to franchise him? What are we willing to pay him? Are we willing to franchise him? Because if you franchise him, all that money is on your books. Do we want to extend this guy? Right? What about a guy on our team? Now we have either a brand new coaching staff or a new coordinator that's not going to fit, that we have liked before, but this guy no longer fits our scheme. Well, we got to start shopping him. What can we get? Can we make him fit? Or is there no chance he's not going to fit this scheme and we can't afford to pay a guy $10 million that doesn't fit the scheme? So to me, evaluating your own team, and anyone worth their salt always says this, is the number one key. Because if you cannot do that, and listen, you're going to let some young guys go. It's part of the deal. There's an element of luck. But your key core guys, or who you want as your key core guys, and who you're willing to pay as your key core guys, you better get that right. Because if you don't, and then like I said, you got to be willing to think big picture. How much your quarterback's making, how much your other star players, that impacts everybody. So can I sell a guy on my own team high? Look at the Chiefs. Now, obviously, he's a really valuable player because he's one of the greatest receivers we've ever seen. But the moment they realize, like, hey, listen, if we got to pick all these players, we'll see how this Chris Jones thing plays out. We still have him under contract. Let's trade Tyreek. When we did. And it's not an easy thing to do, but they did it, and then they maximized the value, right? And then you look at players like Baker Mayfield. Well, if you're the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, you go, we really like Baker Mayfield. We want to keep him on our team next year. But at what price? What is the kind of the desire for his services around the league? Do we franchise him? Can we sign him to a 3-year, $60 million deal and guarantee 40 of it? Or is that a 3-year, $95 million deal? At what price point? Where are we willing to go? So before you even get to the combine and start talking these numbers, you have a pretty good idea of what you are willing to pay. Now, obviously that changes, right? You're not a lock to, like, you're willing to adapt, and you have to be around this time of year. But you have to know a guy's value, and that's why this turns into the stock market. Everything right now is about value. What are you willing to pay? What are you willing to trade for another player? What are you willing to give up a player on your team to another team for? And having an idea before you even attack the next couple weeks is a must. Now, there is going to be some information that you don't know. That next week at the Combine, which is the biggest NFL convention of the year, you start talking and you get things brought to you that weren't even available, right? Or you couldn't even have guessed would have been a possibility. I would imagine when the offseason started, 2 years ago, that the Miami Dolphins never envisioned Tyreek Hill being available. But things change, and you got to be willing to pounce. And you got to be willing to have your operation set up to know, is this worth it? Does this guy fit for what we're willing to give up? Because one thing we know is trades are going to be flying around. And big-name guys that you have not thought of are going to be on the move. That has been a consistent theme of the last couple of years. Think about some of the players that have been traded, from just star quarterbacks to, I know he's not a star anymore, but when Russell Wilson was traded, that was insane. Aaron Rodgers was traded last year. A.J. Brown, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, right? Jalen Ramsey last year. Players are on the move constantly. And depending on your contract, might limit the ability for other teams to be interested. Depending on some of the teams with cap room, might not be super close to winning. But this year, the Houston Texans have a lot of cap room. I would imagine they're going to be pretty aggressive. But maybe they won't, because Caserio learned from Belichick. And that's where I think you have to balance everything. And everything is determined now. The impact of a rookie contract kind of changes the game. For a long period of time before the new CBA in 2011, if you drafted a guy where CJ Stroud was just drafted, his contract was enormous. You remember how big like Matt Stafford and Ndamukong Suh's contracts were? They were fucking huge. They were bigger than a lot of guys that were stars in the NFL already. So this time of year, evaluating your own team is a must. And when you evaluate your own team, you got to evaluate what you need, right? What is essential for your operation. And in basketball, the draft comes and then free agency comes. In football, free agency comes and then the draft comes, right? I think most people, if you're a diehard fan of a given team, you have a pretty good idea of what your team needs. But there are going to be some operations that you go, why didn't we sign a corner? Well, maybe they like their two young corners. They didn't play that much, that they invested picks in the last couple of years. And back to evaluating your own team. Maybe they misevaluate those guys and they're not good enough next year. And you find yourself in a hole. The other thing you have to factor in is salary cap space, how much guys go for. Remember a couple of years ago, J.C. Jackson went for like $45 million guaranteed. So some teams might be very interested in corners, but certain guys price themselves out as the market goes. Here's the other thing. I remember talking to a guy who told me he had this crazy negotiation. This was like 6-7 years ago. And his coach really wanted the player. And basically at the time told him, no matter what, get this player. And he's like, this wasn't some quote unquote star, but this was a guy given, I think it was a little under $15 million guaranteed. At first, the number started at like 5 or 6, and he felt pretty good. Then a couple other teams got involved, and the number ended up closer to $14 million. He's like, not in a million years would I have done this deal, but like I got the, from the decision maker, make sure we get this guy on our team. And ultimately, the guy ended up not playing. It turned out not to really matter. But at the time, whoever the decision maker is, and this is why so many bad deals happen, especially when coaches get involved, is because I got to have that guy. And anyone that's good at business, especially a lot of GMs, they're not as emotionally tied. Pull out, pull back. Coaches don't like to do that. Coaches feel like, I have to have this guy for my defense or offense. And that's an element to really keep an eye on over the next couple of weeks. I do think the understanding, though, of your personnel department and the scheme in going into the combine and free agency is a must. Because I think we see so many poor signings because the coaching staff and the front office is not on the same page. And the one thing a coach can do once I sign a guy, well, a week or two in a training camp, if that guy doesn't like that player, it's not going to work. And that's why historically, beside the can't miss guys, like if Deion Sanders is a free agent or Reggie White's a free agent, but a lot of guys, it's a coin flip. Free agency is not an easy proposition, especially when you have to acknowledge to buy a good free agent. I don't care what position you are, but especially corners, D linemen, offensive tackles, you're paying 130, 140 cents on the dollar. Look last year. Sean Payton needed an offensive tackle. I got to have a right tackle. He gave Mike McGlinchey $55 million. Not a general manager in the NFL that would do that. Just wouldn't happen. But when a coach gets involved and gets to run the show, that's how deals like that happen. Mike McGlinchey, let's face it, probably $25, $30 million guaranteed guy. But in free agency, you already pay a premium on top of that. And then you pay I got to have this guy tax. And that's essentially what happens with a lot of these players is the coach gets involved, maybe even an owner gets involved, a got to have you tax. And free agency is not the cream of the crop. Nick Bosa, Micah Parsons, Jamar Chase, obviously most quarterbacks are not involved in that market. So you're paying a premium on probably at best a B-plus player. At best, a lot of B- C-plus level players who then you start paying as B-plus, A- players. So it's a crazy time of year, but it's a fun time of year. And it's when you really can add players to your team that, especially if you're a good team, can change the trajectory of either your offense or your defense. Get in on the action with DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. New customers who deposit $5 or more can get a no-sweat bet up to $1,000 back in a bonus bet. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use the code JOHN. New customers can get a no-sweat bet up to $1,000 if your first bet loses. Only on DraftKings Sportsbook with code JOHN. The crown is yours. And if we look at some of the biggest question marks coming into this kind of upcoming offseason, I think number one is easily the quarterbacks, right? Cousins is a free agent. And at the time when he was injured, he was playing the best football of his life. If that Kirk Cousins had finished the season and the Minnesota Vikings had gotten the playoffs, I think you're looking at he's not going to get a 5 or 6 year contract at 36 years old. But I think at minimum, you're talking 3 years, $40 million a year, 120 plus million dollars, probably $100 million guaranteed. I don't know how I could pay the guy right now if I'm not the Minnesota Vikings. Because one, he's an older player that had a major injury. And two, he's not a very good athlete. So, like, Aaron Rodgers is never going to be the same. Hell, Aaron Rodgers wasn't the same when the Jets got him. He could not move nearly as well as he did 3 or 4 years ago. He was not the same athlete. Well, Cousins isn't a good athlete. So now you get a guy that couldn't move that great in the first place coming off this major injury. And I think you have to separate the player that was, which was a really good player, especially relative to the rest of the NFL. But some of these teams that need quarterbacks, Atlanta, New England, I would be very hesitant to give him several years and a lot of money. I really would. That's why I think the betting market has, the favorites to keep his services is Minnesota. But the thing I wonder with Minnesota is, like, they were ready to move off him last offseason. They tried to trade him to the San Francisco 49ers. He was readily available. And now you're getting a guy coming off an injury. Now, of course, they would take him back at a cheap cost, especially well under what he was just making. But let's face it, in the way free agency works, a couple teams get involved. His contract, to me, is the most fascinating thing of all of free agency. It really is, because of the position he plays, of the headline it will be. But is this guy full go week one? Does he even look remotely the same? I mean, early on in the season, is he 50% of what he was? I would be terrified. I don't care what the doctors tell me. And that's the other thing around this time of year. You can really like a player as a GM, whether it's a college guy or someone in free agency. But if they're coming off an injury, you're not a doctor. Most of these guys have no clue about any of this stuff. How could you? So when the doctor looks at you and goes, Drew Brees' shoulder is never going to be the same, what are you supposed to look at him and say, no, he's going to be fine? Or when someone in the college draft, like, this is one of the best players in the draft, it's like the doctor looks at you, he's got a degenerate knee. No, he's going to be okay. We'll just ice it and do extra rehab. No, it's very, very hard to overrule the doctor when it comes. It's one thing with a little thing, right? He's had some shoulder stiffness or whatever, and the doctor's like, I don't really see anything. And you're like, let's risk it. It's another thing when a documented major injury happens and you got to question, like, is it worth it? It's why you got to rely on the doctor. I mean, let's face it, most of these teams that live in major cities have the best surgeons that they're relying on for this information. Not because these surgeons want to be involved with these teams. So when they give you the thumbs up or thumbs down, you kind of just got to roll with it when he gives you the thumbs down. And to me, his physical, and any team that obviously would sign him to a contract, the physical would be enormous. And even then, it's kind of taking educated guesses. And the other guy is clearly Justin Fields. And I have no clue what his market's going to be. I mean, I see some people like, you're going to get a first-round pick for Justin Fields. If the Chicago Bears get a first-round pick for Justin Fields, Ryan Paul should pick Justin Fields up on his shoulders and carry him to that city. He is going into the 4th year of his rookie deal. I don't envision anyone that would pick up the 5th year of that rookie deal right now. So you're getting a guy essentially on a 1-year contract who hasn't even remotely come close to proving that he can throw from within the pocket. You're basically just taking an athlete who's played a bunch and he makes a decent amount of money because he was a relatively high pick. Now, just because I don't think he's going to go for a first-round pick, that's not the way the world works. All it takes is 2 people interested in his services. And let's face it, teams get desperate when it comes to quarterbacks. If I had to guess right now, I would say a second-round pick. And honestly, if the Bears got a second-round pick for him, especially having the number 1 overall pick and the fleecing that they got of the Carolina Panthers, that they should be doing cartwheels. So that would be my educated guess as of February 18th on what Justin Fields gets traded for, but he's getting traded. Caleb Williams is going to be the quarterback for the Chicago Bears. I feel 99.9% sure on that one. Now, I guess they could like another guy in the draft, but what I do feel extremely confident, I'd put it at 100, is that Justin Fields is not going to be on the team. And then with both those quarterbacks, the Pittsburgh Steelers, I read a headline today. There was an article in like the Pittsburgh Gazette that there's like arguments internally about Mason Rudolph and Kenny Pickett, who should be the starter? I have a rule. If you're arguing over who should be my starting quarterback for 2024, Mason Rudolph or Kenny Pickett, you probably need to get a new quarterback. It's probably time to bring another guy in. And I do wonder, the two guys that we just named, Kirk Cousins, depending on his number, would that be of interest to them? And, I do think when you look, they hired Arthur Smith. Who do you have a lot of success with in Tennessee? A mobile quarterback. Now, the one thing with Tannehill is Tannehill was a much better pocket passer than Justin Fields, but maybe Arthur Smith. I mean, part of hiring these guys and paying a coordinator like Arthur Smith a couple $1 million, guy's got a big ego. The guy believes in what he can do. And we can talk shit about his Atlanta experience. A coordinator, just because you're a good coordinator, I don't even judge your head coaching. Like, you look at how bad his offense was, probably overwhelmed. Not a good head coach. But I've seen him be a coordinator, and he was really good. So if he is interested in Justin Fields, then the Pittsburgh Steelers should be interested in Justin Fields. And like I said, if your argument is Kenny Pickett or Mason Rudolph, probably time to get a new quarterback. We mentioned this earlier, but big name players are going to get traded. The question is just who and when. It's going to happen all over the league. And the teams that are most likely to get rid of guys, especially like, damn, that guy got traded, are teams with new coaches. Now, I think the Raiders in New England are a little unique because the guys they hired were on the staff. So, like, when you look at the Raiders, Devontae Adams or Max Crosby obviously is not getting traded. When you look at the Patriots, you convince me. Now, their roster is not that great, especially with big-name guys. But, like, Mac Jones probably get traded for a bag of balls, right? But think about all the other teams with outsider head coaches. Everyone's going to be on the table. That's just the way it works. And you won't know it. Like, it's impossible to guess. If you told me the Seattle Seahawks traded DK Metcalf for a first-round pick, again, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but when you get a new head coach with a new vision and new coaching staff, they bring in all these different ideas. And maybe philosophically, where they've learned, they don't view it the same. And everything's going to be on the table. This is the way it works. So I think those are the teams. I remember being in the league when we'd go to the combine, you would target those teams to go, who on their roster is of interest to us, especially a guy that doesn't feel like it's going to fit their scheme moving forward. And then you talk to him about trades. It's why it happens all the time when a new coach comes in that a quote-unquote big name from that team is no longer on that team. Now, it doesn't guarantee it. I wouldn't operate that way, but that's not the way the league works. So I would say you look around the league at some of the new coaches in the new spots, like I would say their players are going to be available. You would call, if you have interest in some guys in Seattle, like they're not trading Jackson Smith and Jigba or Witherspoon. But if you got some interest in some other guys, like give them a fucking buzz. Give them a call. Carolina, I don't know, Derek Brown, Brian Burns, like, hey, you want these guys still? Because if you don't, we got some interest. You need some picks. You need to restart your operation. Atlanta, like you're going to keep all those offensive players, or you want to get rid of one to help out your defense or help out your line? Because, hey, we'd be interested in this guy. And then it gets back to like, well, what are you willing to pay? Like, is Kyle Pitts on the table? Like, I'm not giving a first-round pick for him, but could I give a 2 and a 3 for the guy? And maybe kind of strike oil? The other thing that's big this time of year is extensions is, the fourth-year guys. So you have your first-round picks, right? Trevor Lawrence is not going to get an extension this offseason. Doesn't make any sense, especially at the price points in which quarterbacks are signing. For him or the Jags. It makes most sense for everybody. Let's just play out this year, his fourth year, and see where we're at the end of the season. But there are a lot of guys in that draft class who are going to want to get paid. And who I would imagine if they don't get paid are going to either do a holdout or a hold in. And I think you can start right away with the Jamar Chases, the Jalen Waddles, the Patrick Surtains, the Devontae Smiths, and Micah Parsons. Those guys are going to want to get broken off. And this is where it gets complicated, is like you can draw a hard line and go, we don't negotiate after the third year for any non-quarterback, right? If you're on a first-round contract, right? Because we have the fifth-year option. Like, that's what the 49ers told Brandon Ayuk this offseason. Nick Bosa did not sign his contract till after his fourth year. He did not get a contract after year 3. So Brandon Ayuk, you just kind of have to wait. And I think that gets very complicated. You either have a hardline stance. Most people are kind of open-minded, willing to do whatever. In terms of what they're willing to do with their guy, when they're willing to do it. But the other thing is these guys that are not first round picks, if you're a second round pick to a seventh round pick, you're eligible to be extended. Look at the Eagles last year. They extended Jalen Hurts after his third season. Now, do they regret that? Would he have made less if they were trying to extend him right now? We could argue that till we're blue in the face, because I don't imagine he would want to take any less right now. He'd be like, well, I'm a Pro Bowler again. Look at my stats. Even though it's like, well, he didn't quite look like what you look like, but this is where it gets very complicated. These agents are good. Everything's based on precedent. Everything's based on these previous contracts. That's where it's a lot like real estate, right? If every home in your cul-de-sac is of similar size and selling for $1 million, you can't put your home on the market for $2 million and expect it to sell. Just like if you're trying to buy it, you can't expect to get that house for $600,000. Like the price is kind of established, give or take a little bit. And extending those guys, listen, you either feel good about it or you don't. Like you feel very good about Micah Parsons and Jalen Waddle and Jamar Chase and Patrick Surtain. Like these guys are high-end players. If you even have to hesitate, not worth it. But if that guy goes on to have a good season, Brandon Ayuk, like, well, now you probably could have got him last year at $18, $19 million a year. He's probably thinking $24 million a year. So you got to decide, we going to pay him that much money? Would we be willing to trade him for a first-round pick and use that pick on a player? There are no right or wrong answers right now. You have to entertain every idea and kind of go from there. So yeah, I mean, I love this time of year. It really is hard to beat. The transactions, the strategy behind everything, right? From free agency to the draft. This is a marketplace, and everything has a dollar sign. Either how much I have to pay a player, how much draft capital I have to use to acquire a player, and the best people at playing the market are usually the best teams. And the teams that have no clue what they're doing are usually like, which is ironic because David Tepper is a great stock trader. Look at what he traded last year for Bryce Young. I think he'd like a redo on that bad boy. Steve Sarkisian. The details of his contract came out. He is basically paid this upcoming year $10.3 million, and through 2030, that $10 million goes up $100,000 every year. So by 2030, he is making $10.9 million. He gets 2 cars, a private jet, game tickets, and a country club membership. Now, that country club membership for you golfers, Austin Country Club, is where the match play PGA Tour used to be. I Googled it yesterday, has a 17-year wait list. Well, if you're the head coach of the University of Texas, you don't wait. You just get the membership for free and you jump the fucking line. I think he's a good example, and I've been very, very hard on Sark. Who, listen, I've always acknowledged he's a good offensive coach. I just looked at his resume. He wasn't a very successful coach till this season, where in this new world we live in, stuff has changed. NIL has a huge impact. When you're at a program that can afford to cut enormous checks, you should never suck, and you should compete for championships. And that's what I would imagine he'll do moving forward, because his roster is going to be so good because of the NIL money behind the University of Texas. But here's the one thing that I will acknowledge that is cool. Listen, I've been fired before. I've had no money before. Like anyone worth their salt goes through shitty times. And depending on the industry you're in, like some of you may never be fired. You change jobs, but you hate it. Maybe you get a new boss. Maybe you are an entrepreneur. Maybe you've gone bankrupt. Maybe you went belly up during COVID. It sucks. But the worst times in your life professionally do not define you. I've always believed they actually make you, because when things are going good, I don't care unless you're like Nick Saban, most people are going to be a little happier. Most people are going to be a little more optimistic. It is hard to keep on moving forward in the lowest points in time in your life, personally or professionally. And Sark, a lot like Lane Kiffin, are 2 good examples. Now, they were saved by Nick Saban. And I think when you think of Saban's legacy, you think of all the championships, and rightfully so. The greatest college coach of all time. But I think in my adult life, he took the two most toxic assistant coaches. Lane Kiffin was fired on the tarmac and was a laughingstock. Sark was run out of USC because he was drunk at team meetings. Like, it doesn't get any worse than those two guys. And he resurrected their careers. And he didn't resurrect their careers like just got them back working again. In 2024, they make a combined $20 million. You could argue Sark in NIL might have the best job in all of college football. Ohio State, Georgia, USC, there would be some other guys. But you could easily make the argument in this world that we live in college football, it doesn't get any better than the University of Texas. Look at his fucking contract. So listen, when you go through the shitty times, like I said, I've been fired twice. It sucks. But like you realize the next day, the sun comes up, people keep going to work, world moves on. You do need help. And most of us need someone to extend a hand. You cannot do it yourself. And they were both very lucky. Now, they were both represented by Jimmy Sexton. But Nick, his willingness to open his doors, and he did it to countless people and change their careers. And when you think about like one knock for Belichick isn't just that he couldn't win with Tom Brady. It's why did all of his assistants suck? Why were they all terrible? How's that fucking possible? They all suck. They all are just like run out of the building. Even a guy that actually wasn't a terrible coach, Brian Flores, hated Tua. Couldn't function with his offensive coaches. The stories in that building with that guy, it was like, Jesus. Now, he's a really good defensive coach. So their team was credible, unlike Josh or Patricia. But like, why do you guys all try to act like this guy? Yet all these guys go to Saban. And in a weird way, because he's so crazy, but so is Bill, they like keep their own personal kind of flavor to it all, but kind of use his model of the structure. And then they go on to succeed. And I'm for second chances. We all make mistakes. I've done a lot of stupid shit in my life. I'd say 95% of it, I wasn't caught. I didn't get in trouble. Easily could have throughout countless times in my youth. Look back like a lot of people, like, how did I get away with that? Sometimes if you're not mature enough to handle some of these situations, you go belly up. And that's what happened to Lane and Sark. And they were both disasters. And then Nick Saban changed their lives. And now they're easily like, Lane Kiffin has turned Ole Miss into an SEC power. Sark is going to be one of the teams that everyone bets on to win the national championship next year. So, incredible story, but I really think that's a feather in the cap of Nick Saban's legacy.